All right, so you are ready to check your work on our third possible pollutant, sediment. And if we think back to our first two, chlorine, our first one, that does not sound healthy for fish. And I don't think that it takes much convincing to say acid rain could be a real problem. But sediment? We've been learning about the rock cycle since really the beginning of our school year, and we know that erosion occurs and sediment should end up in waterways. But the issue, as you're seeing, really is if the sediment amount is just too high. And so we started with watching a soil erosion experiment. So the first question, the hypothesis was up to you. But as you watched that experimenter, you noticed that he kept a lot of things constant. This is question 2. We call those controlled variables. He kept the soil type constant, the amount of soil constant, and the bottle and the setup was the same. He only changed one thing. And what he changed was what was in there in addition to the soil. So he had plain soil, he had some leaves, and he also had ones that had like grass in it, plants in it. And so these are the only right answers here for 3 and 4. You should have highlighted plain soil had the highest erosion rate. So fix that if you need to. You should have highlighted the one with plants had the lowest erosion rate. And then I asked you to draw a conclusion, to come up with like a scientific explanation for that. And the experimenter actually showed you that. He showed you that the roots are kind of like anchors to keep the soil in place. So having plant roots is definitely a good plan. So the next question that I asked you about was, how could this possibly have anything to do with the gray area? And so that is when Juan Tuño introduced you to this guy. Okay. And his name is Anton a log. Remember, I think it's a ton of logs. Some students think it's ant on a log, but you hear log in there. It reminds you that he works in the logging operation. And there's definitely plant removal going on. So I hope for question 6 that you realize the logging operation was definitely a place in the gray area of plant removal. Now let's look at the map a little more closely at right where that is. So it is up here. And I wanted to remind you that the logging operation is actually owned by Don Juan Tuño's uncle, who was our first suspect. So just keep that in mind. Anton log suspect 5 is connected to Don Juan Tuño. Now, the next step in this lesson is that you watched me test the waterways. Remember, Juan Tuño visited my house and brought us water from all the waterways. And I showed you in that video a Secchi disc. Here's another picture of one. Remember, I said it's about the size of a medium pizza. They're always this black and white pattern. It's a standard way to test how clear the water is. So you watched me lower Secchi disc down into the different waterways, and here's what we found. And by the way, I put these in a special order. I know that you're not seeing the map as much from home as you would if it was hanging in our classroom, and so I'm going on this map purposely from the left side to the right side. I'm going from west to east. So the James Pond and Faux River, those are connected. We pinched on white there. The upper and lower Mississippi rivers are connected. That's where we pinched on black. Now, the upper and lower raftas, those are way on the east side of the map. We pinched on white there. And then Lake Adasical, do you remember how that's in the middle of the raftas? There's a dam there. We pinched on white there. And then Gray Bay, it was on white, but barely. It looked a little murky. And so what I wanted you guys to really notice is where I have this red circle, a red oval, that it's the upper and lower Mississippi that has the sediment problem. When we pinch on black, the water is not clear enough to be safe for fish. So at that point, you started digging into the sediment files. And here are some things that you were probably wondering when you started to look in those. Well, how does sediment really kill fish anyway? And where's the sediment actually coming from? And is Anton a log the person that's to blame? And so just a couple of things to highlight there. This is a big key concept about how if you have sediment in the water, it's a darker color, absorbs more of the heat. Now, isn't that kind of weird, though, to think cold water would hold more oxygen? Here's the reason. Think about this, my scientists. What happens when water gets colder? Do the molecules condense or do they spread out? And the right answer to that is that the molecules do condense. So think of it kind of like as in colder water, the molecules are close enough, they can hold that gas in. And as water heats up and the molecules spread out, it's almost like there's no hands, so to speak, to trap it. And the oxygen can go up into the atmosphere. So the idea there again is that hotter water cannot hold as much oxygen, higher temp water. I don't know about you, but I was not sure about this quote. It's a win-win situation to graze on land where I can't plant things because of the steep slope. To me, that's a recipe for high levels of erosion. And we'll keep that in mind. Oh, the other thing here, do you remember reading this? It's a double whammy. That meaning that when temperatures go up in a waterway, the fish actually metabolize. They do their chemical reactions in their body faster and they need more oxygen. But this I thought was super important. Okay. So you might be thinking, well, Mrs. Fickus, why did you put an oval around the lower and upper Mississippi? The reason is those are the two we pinched on black. So I know this sounds kind of funny, but if you think about making like a line graph of the upper Mississippi, it would go like this: 57 degrees, 59 degrees, 58 degrees, 64, right? And the lower Mississippi has that same pattern. So we can see the temperature was pretty consistent 20, 10, and 5 years ago. And then it is spiked up. And remember, 5 years ago, that's when the fish started dying. Oh, yeah, here he is, suspect 5, Anton Alog, asking, can't we just go ahead and clear cut everything? That's pretty suspicious. Okay, so now we get to the last part of this lesson, and you do need to be real careful that you're checking your work perfectly here. So how can, this first one, how can too much sediment in the water actually harm fish? The way I said this simply is it could mess up reproduction. It makes it so we have a pond and we have bass, and they like, you probably have seen this before. I know a lot of you are outdoor folks, but they actually build these nests out of rocks. And if you get too much sediment, they're unable to do that. So that's an example of how too much sediment can mess up their reproduction. I think this one really stood out, that the sediment can clog their gills. So fish don't have lungs, they breathe through their gills. And then this idea of darkening the water, increasing the temperature, we're understanding now that that leads to less oxygen. Okay, so again, number 2 here gets to that idea. More sediment in the water is a temperature increase. An increase in temperature for question 3 equals less oxygen. You should be mastering that concept. Now, 4 and 5 are about the rivers. The raftas, did you guys notice? Let me go back here. I forgot to mention this. Look at the raftas. If we were going to do a line graph, right? Steady at 55 for the last 20 years. So there's no other right way to say this. You needed to have that those temperatures have stayed the same. But the Mississippi is different. Their temperatures, like I showed you, have increased, okay? Now, question number 6. The Mississippis have the highest temperature, and let me get the wording right on this question. So for number 6, you were asked, what connection can you make between these temperatures, meaning the temperatures in the Mississippi, and the sediment testing you watched me do? This is a key question here. And so number 6, the Mississippis have the highest temperature because they were full of sediment. And you saw that. The Secchi disc, actually, that's where I pinched on black. So it should not come as a great shock to us that the Mississippis have the spike in temperature, because they're the ones that were tested to be the darkest waterways, the most sediment filled. Okay, now, number 7. We're getting into real business now about who is to blame. So if we look back at the map for a moment, let me get it here to the gray area again. Anton Alog is working here, right? So if his logging operation was removing these trees, which is happening, and causing soil erosion, the raftas would be a mess. And so now as we go down to that question, it makes us go, how are the rafters really doing? Anton Alog's logging operation would have caused the rafters to be dirty. But are the rafters dirty? No, those were the ones that looked the clearest. I easily pinched on white. I could see to the bottom. Anton Alog can't be to blame. And so you're like, Well, then who is to blame? And then I showed you, had you watch this video. And I'm personally fascinated by the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone. That's 25 years ago now, and how it's actually been very good for the ecosystem. And so the question that I asked you on number 9 was this. Overgrazing can lead to soil erosion. So, how did the wolves being released and reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, how did that end up causing less soil erosion? Here's the story. The wolves, only 14 of them were introduced. Now they estimate their population's about 100, by the way, but the wolves are predators. They started eating deer and other plant-eating animals, herbivores. And as a result, you had less plants. Well, now let's think this through. Less plants being eaten means more plant roots to anchor the soil, leading to less erosion. And you saw rivers really stabilize then, and whole ecosystems flourish where they weren't able to before because of the soil erosion rates. And so that's our story. All right, Mrs. Fickus, though, why are you telling us something about Yellowstone? Because we don't have wolves in the gray area that we know of. But look at this, my scientist. We do have mountain lions. We know there's a history in the gray area of starting and stopping mountain lion hunting. So we definitely have this high-level predator in the food chain with populations going up and down based on hunting. So again, your answer to number 10 should be mountain lions. There's no other right answer there. And then we ended by meeting this guy. We met El Mosquito. And El Mosquito seems like a lot of you, to be honest. He likes the outdoors. He likes to fish. He likes to hunt. He honestly seems to have a respect for nature. When he says we throw the fish back when we get them if they're too small, like we want our ecosystem to be healthy. So now we look here at who's to blame. Here's Parallel Park where El Mosquito's hunting. Notice that it's right here by the upper Mississippi River. And that location is important. Okay, so you should be in your mind choosing between is it Antonologue or El Mosquito that has accounted for the Mississippi River being too high in sediment. Okay, our next 2 days are going to be on pollutant number 4, which is called phosphates. You hear phosphate, phosphorus. You'll learn more tomorrow.